Hello and welcome to today's edition of The Jungle. Today we're going to pick up on page 68. We're just skipping a little bit there where they talk about the planning of their wedding and the fact that they know that money's tight and that they can't have it quite the way they would have liked to have it or that they would have had it at home, but they're okay with that. So, very bottom of 68. About a block away from them, there lived another Lithuanian family, consisting of an elderly widow and one grown son. Their name was something that I can't pronounce. I'm sorry. It starts with an M. I'm going to call her grandmother, because they call her grandmother, whatever that last name is. Okay. Their name was M, and our friends struck up an acquaintance with them before long. One evening they came over for a visit, and naturally, the first subject upon which the conversation turned was the neighborhood and its history, and then grandmother, as the old lady was called, proceeded to recite to them a string of horrors that fairly froze their blood. She was a wrinkled-up and wizened personage. She must have been 80, and as she mumbled the grim story through her toothless gums, she seemed a very old witch to them. Grandmother had lived in the midst of misfortune so long that it came to be her element, and she talked about starvation, sickness, and death as other people might about weddings and holidays. The thing came about gradually. In the first place, as to the house they had bought, it was not new at all, as they had supposed. It was about 15 years old, and there was nothing new upon it but the paint, which was so bad that it needed to be put on new every year or two. The house was one of a whole row that was built by a company which existed to make money by swindling poor people. The family had paid $1,500 for it, and it had not cost the builders $500 when it was new. Grandmother knew that because her son belonged to a political organization with a contractor who put up exactly such houses. They used the very flimsiest and cheapest material. They built the houses dozen at a time, and they cared about nothing at all except the outside shine. The family could take her word as to the trouble they would have, for she had been through it all. She and her son had bought their house in exactly the same way. They had fooled the company, however, for her son was a skilled man who made as high as $100 a month, and he had had enough sense not to marry, and they'd been able to pay for the house. Grandmother saw that her friends were puzzled at this remark. They did not quite see how paying for the house was fooling the company. Evidently, they were very inexperienced. Cheap as the houses were, they were sold with the idea that the people who bought them would not be able to pay for them. When they failed, if it were by only a single month, they would lose the house and all that they had paid on it, and then the company would sell it over again. And did they often get a chance to do that? Diev! Grandmother raised her hands. They did it. How often, no one could say, but certainly more than half of the time. They might ask anyone who knew anything at all about Packingtown as to that. She'd been living here ever since this house was built, and she could tell them all about it. And had it ever been sold before? Why, since it had been built, no less than 4 families that their informant could name had tried to buy it and failed. She would tell them a little bit about it. The first family had been Germans. The families had all been of different nationalities. There'd been a representative of several races that had displaced each other in the stockyards. Grandmother had come to America with her son at a time when, so far as she knew, there was only one other Lithuanian family living in the district. The workers had all been Germans then, skilled cattle butchers that the packers had brought from abroad to start the business. Afterward, as cheaper labor had come, these Germans had moved away. The next were the Irish. There had been 6 or 8 years when Packingtown had been a regular Irish city. There were a few colonies of them still here, enough to run all the unions and the police force and get all the graft. But most of those who were working in the packing houses had gone away at the next drop in wages, after the big strike. The Bohemians had come then, and after them, the Poles. People said that old man Durham himself was responsible for these immigrations. He had sworn he would fix the people of Packingtown so that they would never again call a strike on him. And so he had sent his agents into every city and village in Europe to spread the tale of the chances of work and high wages in the stockyards. The people had come in hordes, and old Durham had squeezed them tighter and tighter, speeding them up and grinding them to pieces and sending for new ones. The Poles, who had come by tens of thousands, had been driven to the wall by the Lithuanians, and now the Lithuanians were giving way to the Slovaks. Who there was poorer and more miserable than the Slovaks, grandmother had no idea, but the packers would find them, never fear. It was easy to bring them, for wages were really much higher, and it was only when it was too late when the poor people found out that everything else was higher too. They were like rats in a trap, that was the truth, and more of them were piling in every day. By and by, they would have their revenge, though, for the thing was getting beyond human endurance, and people would rise and murder the packers. Grandmother was a socialist, or some strange thing. Another son of hers was working in the mines of Siberia, and the old lady herself had made speeches in her time, which made her seem all the more terrible to her present auditors. They called her back to the story of their house. The German family had been of a good sort. To be sure, there had been a great many of them, which was a common failing in Packingtown, but they had worked hard, and the father had been a steady man, and they had had a good deal more than half paid for the house. But then he'd been killed in an elevator accident in Durham's. Then there'd come the Irish, and there had been lots of them too. The husband drank and beat the children. The neighbors could hear them shrieking any night. They were behind with their rent all the time, but the company was good to them. There was some politics back of that, grandmother could not say just what, but the Laffertys had belonged to the War Whoop League, which was a sort of political club of all the thugs and rowdies in the district, and if you belonged to that, you could never be arrested for anything. Once upon a time, old Lafferty had been caught with a gang that had stolen cows from several of the poor people of the neighborhood and butchered them in the old shanty back of the yards and sold them. He had been in jail only 3 days for it, and had come out laughing, and had not even lost his place in the packing house. He had gone all to ruin with the drink, however, and lost his power. One of his sons, who was a good man, had kept him and the family up for a year or two, but then he got sick with consumption. That was another thing, grandmother interrupted herself. This house was unlucky. Every family that lived in it, someone was sure to get consumption. Nobody could tell why that was. There must be something about the house, or the way it was built. Some people said it was because the building had begun in the dark of the moon. There were dozens of houses that way in Packingtown. Sometimes there would be a particular room that you could point out. If anybody slept in that room, he was just as good as dead. With this house, it had been the Irish first, and then a Bohemian family had lost a child of it, though, to be sure, it was uncertain, since it was hard to tell what was the matter with children who worked in the yards. In those days, there had been no law about the age of children. The packers had worked all but the babies. At this remark, the family looked puzzled, and grandmother again had to make an explanation that it was now against the law for children to work before they were 16. What was the sense of that? They asked. They had been thinking of letting little Stanislaus go to work. Well, there was no need to worry, grandmother said. The law made no difference, except it forced people to lie about the ages of their children. One would like to know what the lawmakers expected them to do. There were families that had no possible means of support except the children, and the law provided them no other way of getting a living. Very often, a man could get no work in Packingtown for months, while a child could go and get a place easily. There was always some new machine by which the packers could get as much work out of a child as had been able to get out of a man, and for a third of the pay. I think we've mentioned this before, that children have small hands, and so when a machine gets stuck or jammed, it's not very efficient to have to shut the entire machine down, as in like turn it off, which would be safe, and then fix the machine. Instead, you just stall it out and you have a little kid reach their hand in. And if they lose their hand or their arm or their entire body, there are lots more children in Packingtown. No big deal. You don't have to pay their families anything. No workers' compensation. You just tell the families probably if the kid ran off. And then you pack them into the sausage. To come back to the house again, it was the woman of the next family that had died. That was after there had been nearly 4 years, and this woman had had twins regularly every year. And there had been more than you could count when they moved in. After she died, the man would go to work all day and leave them to shift for themselves. The neighbors would help them now and then, for they would almost freeze to death. At the end, there were 3 days that they were alone before it was found out that the father was dead. He was a floorsman at Jones, and a wounded steer had broken loose and mashed him against a pillar. Then the children had been taken away, and the company had sold the house that very same week to a party of immigrants. So this grim old woman went on with her tale of horrors. How much of it was exaggeration? Who could tell? It was only too plausible. There was that about consumption, for instance. They knew nothing about consumption whatsoever, except that it made people cough. And for 2 weeks they'd been worrying about a coughing spell of Antonos. It seemed to shake them all over, and it never stopped. You could see a red stain wherever he had spit upon the floor. Okay, he has tuberculosis. That's what they're referring to as consumption, because it seemed to be consuming the body. It's really you drowning to death in your lungs. By the time you start to cough up blood, there's nothing that can be done for you. You are pretty far gone at that point. Just as a refresher, tuberculosis is spread by sneezing, where you are exhaling droplets of the disease, coughing, same thing, where you're exhaling droplets of the disease, or spitting. Even as you talk, the little droplets, very fine droplets and mist of spit that comes out of your mouth while you're talking. Very similar to COVID-19 in the way that it's spread, ironically enough. And so when they talk about this house being unlucky and cursed, no, it's just full of tuberculosis germs. But nobody knows about germs. So yeah, the next people who move into the house are also going to get it. It's not ghosts or something like that. Although a ghost is about as easy to understand for these people as the concept of germs would have been, because nobody knew anything about germs. And yet all these things were as nothing to what came a little later. They had begun to question the old lady as to why one family had been unable to pay, trying to show her by figures that it ought to have been possible, and grandmother had disputed their figures. You say $12 a month, but that does not include the interest. Then they stared at her. Interest? They cried. Interest on the money you still owe, she answered. But we don't have to pay any interest, they exclaimed, 3 or 4 people at once. We only have to pay $12 a month. And for this, she laughed at them. You are like all the rest, she said. They trick you and eat you alive. They never sell the houses without interest. Get your deed and see. Then, with a horrible sinking of the heart, Teta Elzbieta unlocked her bureau and brought out the paper that had already caused them so many agonies. Now they sat round, scarcely breathing, while the old lady, who could read English, ran over it. Yes, she said finally, here it is, of course. With interest, thereon monthly, at the rate of 7% per annum. And there followed a dead silence. What does that mean? Asked Jurgis finally, almost in a whisper. That means, replied the other, that you have to pay them $7 next month, as well as the $12. Then again there was not a sound. It was sickening, like a nightmare, in which suddenly something gives way beneath you and you feel yourself sinking down into bottomless abysses. As if in a flash of lightning they saw themselves, victims of a relentless fate, cornered, trapped in the grip of destruction. All the fair structure of their hopes came crashing about their ears. And all the time the old woman was going on, talking. They wished that she would be still. Her voice sounded like the croaking of some dismal raven. Jurgis sat with his hands clenched and beads of perspiration on his forehead, and there was a great lump in Ona's throat choking her. Then suddenly, Teta Elzbieta broke the silence with a wail, and Maria began to wring her hands and sob. All their outcry did them no good, of course. There sat grandmother, unrelenting, typifying fate. No, of course it was not fair, but then fairness had nothing to do with it. And of course they had not known it. They had not been intended to know it. But it was in the deed, and that was all that was necessary, as they would find out when the time came. Somehow or other they got rid of the guest, and then they passed a night of lamentation. The children woke up and found out that something was wrong, and they wailed and would not be comforted. In the morning, of course, most of them had to go to work. The packing houses would not stop for their sorrows, but by 7 o'clock, Ona and her stepmother were standing at the door of the office of the agent. Yes, he told them, when he came, it was quite true that they would have to pay interest. And then Teitelsbieta broke forth into protestations and reproaches, so that the people outside stopped and peered in at the window. The agent was as bland as ever. He was deeply pained, he said. He had not told them, simply, because he had supposed they would understand that they had to pay interest upon their debt, as a matter of course. So they came away, and Ona went down to the yards, and at noontime saw Jurgis and told him. Jurgis took it stolidly. He had made up his mind to it by this time. It was part of fate. They would manage it somehow. He made his usual answer. I will work harder. It would upset their plans for a time, and it would perhaps be necessary for Ona to get work after all. Then Ona added that Teitelsbieta had decided that little Stanislaus would have to work too. It was not fair to let Jurgis and her support the family. The family would have to help as it could. Previously, Jurgis had scouted this idea, but now knit his brows and nodded his head slowly. Yes, perhaps it would be best. They would all have to make some sacrifices now. I told you it's not a happy book. Stop looking at me like that.